Inside the Capitol, under the blinding lights of a nationally televised hearing, Jasmine Crockett confronts Lauren Boebert over racial injustice in law enforcement, a battle of facts versus fury. Boebert lashes out with a venomous insult. Go back to the zoo, trying to humiliate Jasmine in front of 300 million viewers. But just minutes later, Jasmine detonates the room with cold, irrefutable evidence, and a single sentence that turns the insult into Boebert's public downfall. What if the insult meant to destroy her? Just ended Boebert's career instead. Stay with us. This is a story worth every second of your time. The doors to room 2141 opened with a slow creak, not of age but of tension. It wasn't just another day on Capitol Hill. Every seat was filled, every whisper sharpened, every silence loaded with suspicion. Rows of C-SPAN cameras lined the back wall like sentinels. The polished mahogany gleamed under the fluorescence like a stage before detonation. Jasmine Crockett walked in flanked by two aides, head high, navy blazers sharp as a blade. She had no notes in hand, only memory, fire, and lived experience. Across the horseshoe table, Lauren Boebert already sat, arms crossed, lips tightened into a preemptive smirk, like a snake sensing the heat of confrontation. Behind her, lobbyists from three right-wing think tanks whispered to each other in smug anticipation. They didn't come to listen. They came to watch her bleed. To Jasmine's left sat young black students from Howard, mothers gripping old court rulings like lifelines, and civil rights attorneys who'd buried too many before justice ever showed up. They weren't just an audience. They were evidence. The room didn't hum with tension. It thrummed, like a fuse seconds from detonation. Every step Jasmine took to the witness seat echoed louder than it should have. A court stenographer adjusted her glasses like she was preparing to archive history, not just words. A young aide clicked a pen and instantly regretted it. Nothing moved without consequence. Jasmine sat, no throat clearing, no smile, just unflinching eyes and a spine forged in rooms where dignity wasn't handed out, but had to be carved inch by inch. In front of her, a mic, a timer, and a nameplate weighted by more than just her title. Boebert leaned in slowly, hands clasped like a zealot waiting to pounce. She stared. Jasmine stared back. Between them sat decades of buried names, broken courts, and the rage of the unheard. This wasn't a hearing. It was a pressure chamber dressed as democracy, and no one was leaving unchanged. And then, before anyone could exhale, the microphone clicked to life, and Jasmine Crockett leaned in, not to defend herself, but to dismantle the very system that dared to question her place in that room. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. The weight of what she carried spoke louder than volume ever could. Her eyes scanned the chamber, not for approval, not for sympathy, but for the flicker of human recognition. Then she began. Marcus Delaney, she said, her voice steady but unshakably firm. 17, arrested walking home from school, wrong time, wrong hoodie, a red one, held in juvenile detention for 6 months, no charges, no apology, no one even called his mother until the third day. She let the silence do the rest. A few rows back, someone shifted uncomfortably. Jasmine continued, naming the next victim like reading names off a memorial wall. Arlene Chambers, 62, retired nurse. Knocked to the ground during a drug raid, on the wrong house. They broke her collarbone and left her with permanent nerve damage. They offered her a $1,200 settlement, said it was a clerical error. The air in the chamber grew heavier, as if every story she told pulled the ceiling lower. These weren't case files. They were lives interrupted, dignity stolen, futures rewritten by someone else's pen. Keon Rivers, she said, flipping to the next page. 24, pulled over for a broken taillight, died in custody 2 hours later. Cause of death listed as medical episode. The body camera was malfunctioning. She didn't blink. Latasha Dean, 45, held for shoplifting toothpaste. No conviction, but she lost her job and her home. Because jail doesn't just take time, it takes reputation. It takes livelihood. It takes the story people tell about you even after you're proven innocent. She spoke each name not with theatricality, but with the mournful discipline of someone who has said them too many times. Names she had written into court filings, names whispered to her by mothers who couldn't afford lawyers but begged for someone to believe them. Her tone never wavered, but the tension in the room began to crack like glass under pressure. She flipped another sheet. Darnell Grant, 18, tackled in front of a subway station for matching a description. That description? Male, black, hoodie. That's it. She stopped, looked directly into the camera at the back of the room, and let the moment settle. Then she said, "These aren't stories. They're statistics with names, and I carry them because no one else will." She placed the papers down slowly, deliberately, as if they weighed 100 pounds. Then she raised a single page, crisp and white against the room's dark wood paneling. "This is a booking report filed in Mississippi last year. The suspect was described as 5 feet 10 inches, medium build, light complexion. The man arrested, 6 feet 4 inches, dark-skinned, blind in one eye, still jailed for 6 weeks." The sound of breath being held became audible. Jasmine didn't flinch. "And you ask me why trust is broken. It's not broken. It was never built." A mother in the back wiped her eye. A congressional aide stopped typing. Jasmine's voice hadn't changed, but the entire room had. Across the dais, Boebert's smirk wavered for the first time. Not gone, but cracked. "And you ask me why trust is broken," Jasmine repeated softly. "It's not broken. It was never built." She wasn't giving testimony. She was performing triage on the soul of the country, and no one, not even those who came to dismiss her, could look away. But just as the room began to absorb the weight of Jasmine's truth, the silence cracked, sharp, artificial, cut through by a voice that seemed more eager to provoke than to understand. Lauren Boebert didn't lean into the moment. She lunged. Her elbows hit the table with practiced impatience, voice rising not from curiosity but from a hunger to corner, to condescend. "So what you're saying," she snapped, her tone heavy with mockery, "is that law enforcement is just, what? Racist by default? That our justice system, our flag, our Constitution, is inherently corrupt because you say so?" The words weren't questions. They were darts, hurled with the smugness of someone confident no one in power had ever looked at her as a threat. She spoke over Jasmine's stillness with the self-righteousness of someone who had never been followed in a store, never had to teach their child what to say if pulled over, never had to wonder if the color of their skin would cost them mercy or their life, and she didn't stop. Boebert pressed harder, her voice louder, clearer, crueler. "Are you suggesting that police officers wake up every morning looking to hunt people who look like you?" She said it with the cadence of a TV punchline, but there was no laughter, just stunned silence and the shifting of bodies in chairs that now felt too stiff, too tight, too close to the truth. One young girl in the second row pressed her hands against her knees to keep them from trembling. A civil rights attorney near the back closed his eyes as if he'd just seen history attempt to repeat itself. Again, live on camera. For a long moment, Jasmine didn't speak. Not because she was shaken, but because she knew the difference between silence that surrenders and silence that studies. She looked at Boebert, not with anger, not with scorn, but with something far more dangerous: clarity. And then she answered without blinking, without flinching, "I'm saying that law enforcers are human, and humans carry bias, and sometimes those humans choose their targets based on skin, not sin." The words landed like a gavel that refused to be ignored. Her tone wasn't defensive, it was diagnostic. She wasn't accusing, she was identifying. The room didn't erupt, it compressed, like lungs holding in something too large to breathe. Even the court stenographer slowed, as if typing each word required precision, not just of hands, but of conscience. On the dais, Boebert froze. Not visibly, not dramatically, but in that subtle way a person does when they realize their lines have stopped working. Behind her, a staffer who had been smiling moments earlier now stared at the table, expression blank. The performative certainty gone. Jasmine said nothing more. She didn't have to. The truth had already landed, and it didn't need to raise its voice to echo. But the moment Jasmine dared to speak of children, black, brown, forgotten, those whose first encounters with law enforcement were through trauma rather than trust, Boebert snapped. And what came next didn't just cross a line, it detonated one. Lauren Boebert shifted in her chair with the deliberateness of someone who wasn't searching for clarity, but for a strike point. Her fingers tapped the table in rhythm with her breath, slow and tight, like a fuse being measured. She waited until Jasmine had just finished naming a 12-year-old boy, tackled by 3 officers for fitting the description of a car thief, just before she could continue with another child's name. Then Boebert struck, her voice cold and flat, sharpened by contempt, void of hesitation. Maybe if people like you didn't act like street animals, you wouldn't be treated like one. And then, after a beat that seemed carved out of ice, she leaned closer to the microphone. No smirk, no shift in tone, just something far more chilling, intention. Or maybe, just go back to the zoo. The sentence didn't rise in volume. It didn't need to. It landed with the force of a dropped weapon, precise, public, and unmistakably personal. Time didn't freeze, it recoiled. No one moved, not because they were unsure of what they heard, but because they knew exactly what they heard. The sentence had come from a place too old and too familiar to be misunderstood. Every syllable carried the echoes of centuries, wrapped in modern makeup, broadcast under fluorescent lights in the heart of the so-called free world. The gallery didn't gasp. They stiffened. The collective stillness was louder than any protest. A mother near the back gripped her daughter's wrist so tightly the girl winced. A civil rights attorney sitting by the wall closed his eyes with a slow exhale, like someone watching a wound reopen. Across the room, a security guard's hand flinched near his radio, not because of a threat, but because the air now felt dangerous. One congressional aide, young, white, and visibly shaken, lowered her tablet onto her lap and stared blankly at the floor, unsure whether she was supposed to keep transcribing or start breathing again. In the third row, a retired firefighter who had sat through countless hearings, funerals, and fights for pension reform rose to his feet. With slow, deliberate motion, he took off his navy blue cap, the one with the insignia of his old engine company, and bowed his head. It wasn't an act of protest. It wasn't even a gesture of honor. It was grief. Grief for what had just been said, and for the reality that a statement like that could still be said in the middle of a congressional hearing, on national television, by a sitting member of Congress, and not immediately silenced. Boebert didn't blink. She didn't look around to assess the damage. She didn't need to. She knew what she had done. The words weren't a slip. They were a mirror, held up, thrown down, and ground into the marble under her heel. And Jasmine Crockett, she didn't move. She didn't break eye contact. Her spine remained straight, her hands still locked on the table, as if she were holding on to the very idea of restraint with both fists. Her jaw was set, not in anger, but in the kind of generational endurance passed down from women who have been insulted, belittled, erased, and who never once had the luxury of breaking down when the world broke open in front of them. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to reduce her humanity to metaphor. It wouldn't be the last. But never before had it happened in this room, under oath, under lights, in the heart of the government that claimed to serve all its people. Jasmine's silence in that moment wasn't empty. It was loaded, not with fear, not with pain, but with precision. The kind of silence that comes when your opponent hands you the very blade they intended to cut you with, and you choose not to use it, because you know they've already done more damage to themselves than you ever could. Behind her, one young man in a Howard University sweatshirt slowly stood up. He didn't say a word. He didn't lift a fist. He just stood, like a monument, like a verdict. A few rows over, a woman clutched her purse against her chest, as if trying to hold something sacred inside. The committee chair leaned toward the microphone, unsure whether to intervene, apologize, or run from the moment altogether. No one dared to speak, not yet. The air was no longer thick, it was unbreathable, because in a single line, Boebert had made something painfully clear. This wasn't just a disagreement, This wasn't just about politics. This was about who gets to be seen as fully human in America, and who's still being spoken to like they never belonged in the first place. Maybe if people like you didn't act like street animals, you wouldn't be treated like one. Or maybe just go back to the zoo. And there it was. The mask pulled off, the curtain yanked back, the truth no longer whispered in dark corners, but amplified in front of the entire nation. The words had been spoken, deliberate, venomous, and echoing, and now they hung in the air like smoke after an explosion, choking the room in silence as everyone waited for Jasmine Crockett to break. But Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't twitch, didn't shift, didn't reach for water or words. She sat in absolute stillness, as if the hate hurled at her had turned to ash before it could reach her skin. The silence that followed wasn't a pause. It was a stand. Her spine remained upright, not stiff with pride, but forged by experience. Her eyes stayed locked on Boebert, and what stared back wasn't rage or shock. It was something colder, older, a gaze that had seen this before, in classrooms, in courtrooms, in comments passed off as jokes. 7 full seconds passed, and yet it felt longer, because time stretches when truth is holding its breath. Across the room, no one dared to move. Even the clock on the wall seemed to hesitate between ticks, as if unsure whether it was bearing witness to a hearing or a reckoning. That kind of silence doesn't just happen, it's earned. It's the kind of silence that falls not because someone's been defeated, but because everyone knows someone just won something far bigger than the room itself. And then Jasmine leaned in, just slightly, not enough to threaten, but enough to claim. Her voice was low, steady, and so clear it seemed to slice through the air rather than rise into it. I'm not going back to the zoo. I was never in one. But thank you, Ms. Boebert, for showing America exactly what a cage looks like. From the inside. She paused, letting the words settle. Not to provoke applause, but to give the truth time to sting. I wasn't raised in captivity. I was raised in resistance. And every time someone tries to chain me with language, I remind them, I don't bite, I build. You don't get to define civility while throwing verbal stones. Not when the hands that built this country were shackled before they were ever allowed to write its laws. This isn't about hurt feelings. It's about a system that's still using cages of speech to silence the voices that refuse to be tamed. She didn't blink after she said it. She didn't raise an eyebrow or allow even the curl of a smirk. Her delivery was so precise, so disciplined, that it felt like the words had been waiting their whole life to be spoken, and finally found someone worthy of speaking them. It wasn't a comeback, it wasn't a clapback. It was a reversal of power, executed with scalpel clarity and moral velocity. There was no anger in her voice, only truth. A truth that had sat silent for far too long, and now had the mic and the world's attention. For a split second, Boebert looked almost human, just a flicker of uncertainty behind the eyes. It passed quickly, buried beneath bravado, but those watching saw it. They saw the moment where the insult was no longer a sword, but a spotlight. And under that light, the cruelty wasn't clever. It was cowardly. Behind Jasmine, a congressman known for avoiding public gestures of support shifted forward and gave a faint, solemn nod. Not to take a side, but to acknowledge the shift. Something in the room had changed, permanently. A boundary had been crossed, yes. But more importantly, a line had been drawn. Jasmine didn't just withstand the attack, she redefined the battlefield without ever raising her voice. No one applauded, no one dared, because the room was still full of tension, full of history, full of clarity. And Jasmine Crockett, without anger or theatrics, had made one thing impossible to deny. She had never belonged in a cage, but she knew exactly what one looked like, and more importantly, who was sitting inside it. And while the chamber remained frozen in the shadow of Jasmine's words, the nation on the other side of the screen was already in motion. Not with outrage alone, but with a slow, rising clarity that something had broken. And this time, it wasn't going back into silence. By the time the sun rose over Washington, D.C., the ripple had become a wave. Across the country, newspaper kiosks displayed a single, unflinching phrase stamped across their front pages like a national scar. Go back to the zoo. Above it, a photo of Jasmine Crockett mid-sentence. Shoulders squared, mouth firm, gaze leveled like a lighthouse through storm. It wasn't posed and it wasn't softened. There was no filter on the fury that the country had just witnessed. What America saw in that frame wasn't just a woman responding to insult. It was a nation being forced to reckon with the ugliness it often leaves unspoken. Major outlets ran double spreads not about partisan clash, but about the moral weight of what had unfolded. One Texas paper published its front page without commentary, just Boebert's quote in bold, Jasmine's face below it in a black background. That silence spoke louder than any editorial. In schools from Detroit to El Paso, teachers printed transcripts and turned them into impromptu lesson plans. In one Chicago high school, an entire civics class paused their curriculum to dissect Jasmine's response line by line. "Why did she wait 7 seconds?" a student asked. The teacher didn't answer. He just pressed play again. In Georgia, a 4th-grade teacher took down the American flag from her bulletin board just for a moment and replaced it with a printout of Jasmine's quote, "I wasn't raised in captivity, I was raised in resistance." At a church in Jackson, Mississippi, a pastor threw away his pre-written sermon and instead opened his Bible to Psalm 82, verse 3, "Defend the weak and the fatherless. Uphold the cause of the poor and the oppressed." Then he looked out at the congregation and said, "Today, that's what she did." Community centers held night meetings where elders cried quietly, where teenagers sat still for once, where nobody argued politics, only pain. Meanwhile, in a quiet corner office of Jasmine's Dallas district headquarters, the mail started piling up. At first a trickle, then a storm. Hundreds, then thousands of envelopes, most handwritten, many marked confidential, all addressed simply to Ms. Crockett. Inside were memories, painful, honest, and carefully folded. One letter came from a grocery store clerk in Nebraska. In 1974, they called me that in the back parking lot of my high school. I still hear it in my sleep. Another from a retired bus driver in Iowa. "My daughter asked me last night what you meant when you said cages of speech." I told her, "That's what they tried to put your grandmother in." Staffers stopped sorting the mail. They started pinning it to the walls. First the hallway, then the waiting room, then the conference space. Aides took turns reading them aloud during lunch, each voice cracking at least once. One envelope arrived unsealed, with only 8 words on a torn sheet of paper. "You didn't flinch. You spoke for me." Then came the knock on the door, deliberate, slow, and unmistakable. A group of retired black veterans stood outside, coats pressed, medals shining, expressions carved by years of discipline and memories they'd spent decades trying to forget. They asked for no cameras, no headlines. They only wanted time. Jasmine greeted them with a quiet nod, and they walked into her office like men entering a sacred space. "We fought under a flag," one began, voice steady but aged, "that let us be called animals while we wore the uniform. And now you fought back, in a suit with a sentence." They told her about being called boys in uniform, about being shoved off sidewalks in the South, about saluting a country that didn't salute back. "We came here today," another said, "because what you did, that was a salute back. To us, to every one of us who took the hit and never got the mic." Jasmine didn't speak much. She listened, not out of deference, but out of understanding, because the moment wasn't about her voice anymore. It was about what her voice had awakened. One veteran, the eldest among them, pulled a folded handkerchief from his coat and set it on her desk. "Carried this through 3 tours, he said quietly. "Tonight I don't need it anymore." No one moved, no one cried, but the silence that followed wasn't empty. It was reverent. This wasn't backlash. It was awakening. What had started as an attempt to humiliate one woman had become something far more powerful, a mirror to the nation. And Jasmine Crockett, without asking for it, had become the reflection people could no longer look away from. But as the letters kept arriving and the veterans made their quiet exit, the impact of Jasmine's words had already left the walls of her district office and begun cracking the marble pillars of power that had stood undisturbed for far too long. By noon the next day, the West Wing issued a statement, not from a deputy, not buried on a weekend, but a formal release under the presidential seal. 3 paragraphs long. Director. No euphemisms, no distancing, it read. Congresswoman Boebert's remarks during the hearing were not only unacceptable, they were beneath the dignity of public service. We cannot claim to build a more perfect union while permitting dehumanizing language to echo through the halls of democracy. The wording was restrained, but the intent wasn't. Inside the press briefing room, reporters didn't ask if the White House approved the statement. They asked if more members of Congress would be named. The message was clear. This time, silence wouldn't be tolerated from anyone who claimed to govern. And behind the press podium, the president's press secretary said what many had waited years to hear. Racism isn't just a relic, it lives. And when it shows its face, especially with a microphone in front of it, we will call it what it is. The economic fallout followed just as swiftly and with precision. By Friday afternoon, 2 of Lauren Boebert's biggest financial backers, a defense contractor headquartered in Virginia and a telecommunications conglomerate based in Colorado, announced the immediate withdrawal of their PAC support. One statement cited a moral breach of public decorum. The other simply read, "There is no strategic value in aligning with rhetoric that diminishes human dignity." Boebert's campaign team scrambled, privately pleading with donors for time, for context, for spin, but none came. A leaked internal email showed the subject line, "We can't protect this one." Aides began to quietly exit the campaign. One senior advisor texted a journalist off the record, "You can't keep feeding red meat to the base when the whole country's now watching the butcher." Within the Capitol, things moved slower, but no less severely. In a closed-door meeting of senior Republican leadership, the conversation shifted from damage control to disciplinary precedent. No cameras, no press, but enough whispers leaked. One veteran lawmaker reportedly asked, "If this isn't grounds for removal from the Oversight Committee, what is?" By the end of the weekend, a letter signed by 6 GOP members from swing districts was delivered to the Speaker's office requesting that Lauren Boebert be formally asked to step down from her seat on the House Oversight and Accountability Committee. It was not a Democratic petition. It came from her own party. The text was curt. The integrity of this chamber cannot withstand public defenders of open dehumanization. For a party already strained between factions, it was more than a fracture. It was a warning flare from within. And while Boebert fought to contain the fire, Jasmine Crockett was being called to light one of her own, this time not in a courtroom or a committee hearing, but on a campus stage. Georgetown Law School extended a formal invitation to Jasmine to deliver their keynote lecture for the fall symposium on language and human rights in American institutions. The letter didn't beg for controversy, it welcomed clarity. "We believe that your words, spoken in the face of extraordinary provocation, embody the essence of what this generation of legal scholars must confront. That freedom of speech is not freedom from consequence, and that dignity, once denied, demands a sharper tongue to reclaim it." Within hours, the invitation became public, and within days, the symposium had to move venues twice to accommodate demand. Law students from across the country requested early access to her remarks. Some called her the legal voice of the post-truth era. Others simply called her necessary. But behind all the headlines, behind the press statements and PAC withdrawals and podiums, remained the truth that kept echoing through every frame of that viral hearing. Jasmine Crockett had not been scheduled to deliver a revolution. She had come to testify. She had come prepared with files, case law, precedent, and facts. But what the world saw, what it felt, was something else. They saw a woman confronted with a centuries-old insult, reborn through a live microphone, delivered in a room carved by the very people who once wrote her ancestors out of the Constitution. And they saw her answer it not with fury, but with precision, with intellect, with restraint sharper than any weapon ever held in anger. There was something deeply unsettling, even to those who had always dismissed Jasmine as just another progressive voice, about how calm she had remained under such vile provocation. Commentators debated whether her response had been too controlled, too intellectual, too rehearsed, but they missed the point. She hadn't answered as a politician or a media figure. She had answered like a woman who had heard that insult before, who had carried it like scar tissue beneath her blazer, and who, when handed the mic, chose not to scream, but to level the room with truth. Back in Congress, as calls for Boebert's censure circulated through both formal and informal channels, one conservative representative reportedly walked into Jasmine's office without staff, without press, and closed the door behind him. According to a staffer, he stood for a moment in silence before saying, "I've served 3 terms. I thought I'd seen every kind of speech in here, but I've never seen one stop time." Jasmine didn't reply. She didn't have to. Her words were still doing their work long after she'd said them. And maybe that was the most damning thing of all. For Boebert, for her defenders, for everyone who believed that dehumanization was just another point of view. Jasmine's power didn't come from outrage. It came from composure, from truth, from choosing not to return insult with venom, but to let the weight of centuries do the speaking for her. This wasn't about party lines anymore. It was about moral fault lines, lines that had cracked, split, and now demanded a reckoning. And Jasmine Crockett, whether she asked for the moment or not, had become its epicenter. Not because she had planned to, but because she was ready when it came. But even as the nation reeled and institutions responded, there remained one space, the very chamber where it all began, that had not yet heard the last word from Jasmine Crockett. That changed when Congress reconvened under a different rule. No crossfire, no rebuttals, just her voice. Room 2141 had never been quieter. For once, it wasn't microphones buzzing or cameras clicking that filled the air. It was anticipation, the kind that clings to walls, the kind that vibrates under the skin. There were no signs, no placards, no panels or pundits. No one was there to debate. This wasn't a press event or a roundtable. This was something far rarer in Washington. Silence granted not by order, but by respect. The seats were full, the dais lined with faces from both sides of the aisle, their partisanship quieted, if only for now. Jasmine Crockett stood alone in the center. No notes, no distractions, only a single sheet of paper folded in half and her hand resting gently atop it. Her suit was deep blue, measured, calm, but her presence was thunder. She took a breath, not a dramatic one, but the kind that comes before saying something you've carried for years and never thought you'd get the chance to say out loud in front of the people who helped write the rules you had to survive. "I want to tell you a story," she began. No introduction, no titles, just gravity. "I was 8 years old." Her voice was low, but it traveled. The room leaned in, not visibly, but viscerally. "My teacher had us break into groups for a science project. I went to one table. A boy looked up at me and said, 'No, you can't be in our group. You look like a monkey.'" A pause, not for emphasis, just memory. The teacher was 5 feet away. She heard it. She didn't correct him. She didn't ask me if I was okay. She said, "Let's not cause trouble today, Jasmine. Just find another group." No one in the chamber stirred. The words had landed and they were heavy. "That day," Jasmine said slowly, "I learned 2 lessons. 1, there are things they will call you before they even know your name. And 2, silence, when well-dressed, can be just as violent as slurs." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't look for approval. She simply held eye contact with no one and everyone all at once. And the silence inside those polished congressional walls now had shape and meaning. She shifted her weight slightly, folding the paper once more in her fingers, but never opening it. "When I was 14, she continued, I was invited to a study group at the local library. I had on my best shirt. I carried my APUS history textbook, a spiral notebook, and a bag of Skittles a beat past. A parent took one look at me and told their daughter not to sit next to me. Said I looked too angry. Said my hair made me seem aggressive." Her hand brushed the side of her curls instinctively before returning to her side. "I didn't speak. I hadn't said a word. But I was disqualified by the expression on my face and the coils in my hair." This time the silence in the chamber wasn't just still, it was stunned. "They didn't say I didn't belong there," she said softly, "but they made sure I knew it." Jasmine looked up, finally making eye contact with the members seated across from her. Her stare wasn't confrontational. It was unwavering, the way sunlight doesn't apologize for falling through a window. Those weren't isolated moments, she continued. They were the beginning of a pattern where everything about you, your voice, your posture, your hair, your skin, is up for review before you've even spoken. And then, if you do speak, suddenly you're angry, you're emotional, you're threatening, you're unprofessional. She paused again, but her breath remained steady. You're told you don't belong. She gestured gently toward the room around her, and her voice dropped lower. But here's what no one told me back then. It's not that I didn't belong. It's that they never imagined someone like me would ever get in. Now she took a step forward. Just one, enough to shift the center of the room. So when I sat here last week and heard one of my colleagues tell me to go back to the zoo, I didn't hear that insult for the first time. Her words were no longer just recollections. They were blades, cutting clean, quiet, and unforgettable. I heard echoes from the playground, from the library, from 1,000 rooms where I stayed silent to stay safe. She looked toward the dais not to call them out, but to call them in. But I don't owe anyone silence anymore. And I certainly don't owe this institution the comfort of pretending that words like those don't still get spoken inside these walls. There was a tension in the room now, not because anyone disagreed, but because too many knew she was right. Some fidgeted with pens, some crossed their arms, others simply bowed their heads. Jasmine let the silence breathe again before delivering the words that would outlast the hearing itself. They say I don't belong here, but the irony is, it's their words that don't fit this chamber. She said it like a final verdict. No anger, no theater, just fact, just truth. And the moment it left her mouth, it belonged to history. She stepped back from the mic, folded the note she never opened, walked away without waiting for acknowledgement. And no one spoke. Not because they weren't allowed to, but because what could be said after that? In the back row, a congressional staffer wiped his eyes. A Republican senator leaned forward with his hands folded, looking down, not in shame, but in recognition. A reporter lowered her phone, choosing not to record the moment, but to simply witness it. And as Jasmine Crockett left the chamber, the silence didn't break. It followed her, like a truth that finally had a voice powerful enough to carry it past the marble walls, out into a country still deciding who belongs and who doesn't. And this time, the answer wasn't going to come from the Constitution. It was going to come from the people watching, and whether they had the courage to listen. But even as Jasmine's words settled like stone across the nation's conscience, the machinery of damage control inside Capitol Hill was already creaking to life, desperate, defensive, and doomed to collapse under the weight of what came next. 3 days after Jasmine's searing testimony, Boebert reappeared, not in Congress, not before colleagues, but in the soft glow of a home office webcam, framed by a bookshelf and a carefully placed American flag. She spoke directly into the camera, voice carefully modulated, hands occasionally clasped for effect. What people heard, she said, was taken entirely out of context. It was edited. I was being sarcastic. The media twisted my words, as they always do, to fit a divisive narrative. She didn't apologize. She redirected. The real problem, she continued, is the weaponization of outrage by the radical left. The video lasted just over 4 minutes, ending with a pointed call to fight back against the lies. And within minutes, it was uploaded across every major platform. But it wasn't met with relief. It was met with disbelief. Because before the video had even finished circulating, a recording surfaced, one that would drown her defense in its own contempt. It came from behind the curtain, recorded during the break immediately after the televised hearing. A hot mic, a laughing aide, and Boebert's unmistakable voice. "Did you see her face?" she chuckled. "I thought she was going to throw the mic at me. Go back to the zoo. Worked like a charm." A beat of laughter followed. "What? I'm just saying what everyone else is thinking." The leak didn't come from a political opponent. It came from inside the building. An intern, reportedly sickened by what they heard. The clip was barely 30 seconds long, but it detonated with the force of a scandal no spin team could contain. The sound was clear. The intent was unmistakable. And the mask, The last desperate layer of plausible deniability was gone. No sarcasm, no media distortion, just cruelty, candid and cold, like truth caught off guard. By nightfall, the halls of Congress echoed not with debate, but with whispers, urgent, clipped, and carrying names. What had been a scandal was now a firestorm. Senior members huddled in corners, staffers avoided eye contact in elevators. On the floor, allies grew silent, and opponents sharpened their questions. Boebert's office issued a statement claiming the leak was illegal and selectively edited. But no one was buying it, not this time. The tone of the Hill had changed. This was no longer a partisan flashpoint. It was a test of how far someone could go before the institution that empowered them finally said, enough. Behind closed doors, a rare emergency session of the Republican caucus was held. The room was soundproof, but the tension leaked like steam from under a steel door. Senior strategists paced the carpet while House veterans folded their arms, trading glances that carried more meaning than words. Boebert sat in silence, flanked by aides who looked more like handlers now. When the tape was played aloud, no one interrupted. No one defended it. One congressman from Pennsylvania reportedly whispered, "Jesus Christ," under his breath as the laughter played. The silence afterward wasn't procedural. It was shame. Then came the first formal recommendation. Quiet, measured, and delivered with the kind of calm that meant it had been written days in advance. 3 Republican members, one from Ohio, one from Nebraska, one from Utah, submitted a statement to leadership urging disciplinary review. Not expulsion, not censure, but removal from committee roles, particularly her seat on the House Oversight and Accountability Committee. It is not about party, the letter read. It is about precedent. If this chamber does not protect its moral center, it forfeits its credibility entirely. It was a rare kind of language, not firebrand, not performative, institutional. News of the closed-door hearing leaked within hours, and by morning the press had descended on the Capitol steps. Reporters no longer asked whether Boebert's remarks had been offensive. They asked how the House intended to restore its legitimacy after allowing them to go unpunished. Cameras flashed, aides deflected. But behind the marble and mahogany, the machine was moving, slowly, carefully, toward accountability. Boebert herself didn't appear. Her spokesperson offered a single line. The Congresswoman will continue serving her district with strength and resolve. But no one believed that strength meant what it used to. Meanwhile, in Jasmine Crockett's office, there was no celebration, only quiet focus. Staff sorted mail in silence. The phones rang less now, not with outrage but with opportunities. Invites, requests, recognition. But Jasmine stayed off camera. No victory laps, no press tours. She knew the moment wasn't about her survival. It was about what the nation chose to do with what had been exposed. When asked for comment about the leaked Boebert tape, Jasmine issued only one line to the press. Some truths shout, others laugh, but both reveal the same sickness. And that was the power of it all. Jasmine didn't need to react. She had already won the moment that mattered, by standing still while the rest of the room collapsed around the weight of its own silence. What came next wouldn't be about a headline. It would be about whether the institution that once asked her to go back to the zoo would now finally begin the long, painful work of evolving beyond the cage it built for itself. And as the fallout from Boebert's unraveling exposed deeper fractures in the system, Jasmine Crockett didn't retreat into silence or celebration. Instead, she redirected the spotlight toward a battlefield she had never truly left: the future. The announcement came without a press conference, no flashing cameras, no podium, no campaign-like flourish, just a single email sent from Jasmine's congressional office, followed an hour later by a short video message. No frills, no intro music, just her. She sat in her office, the shelves behind her filled with case books and framed photographs of the Black women lawyers and judges who had inspired her. And she spoke not about what had happened, but about what needed to happen next. "We can't wait for the next generation of justice," she said quietly. "We have to build it. Now, name by name." And with that, she introduced caged words, free futures, a scholarship fund seeded by her personal honorarium from speaking engagements, early donations from allies, and support from organizations that had watched her stand unshaken in the face of insult and emerge with purpose. The fund was simple in design but bold in mission: to identify, support, and mentor students of color, especially those from underfunded public schools, who dreamed of practicing law or fighting for human rights. Not someday. Now the name itself, Caged Words, Free Futures, was more than a poetic phrase. It was a reckoning. It was a response to every slur she had ever endured, every phrase used to shrink her identity into something caricatured, weaponized, or dismissed. But now those same words would fund resistance. Her team published a video montage alongside the launch. Quiet clips of students studying in crowded kitchens, girls walking into school past metal detectors, boys being searched by officers outside the gates of their middle schools. And intercut with it all, snippets from Jasmine's now historic hearing, her voice calm and piercing as she responded to dehumanization with surgical dignity. Within 48 hours, the fund surpassed its first-year goal. Within a week, over 2,300 applications had arrived, some typed, some handwritten, some with entire family stories folded in the margins. One girl wrote, "I want to be the kind of lawyer who doesn't just win cases, but makes sure the people I represent feel human again." Lauren Boebert shifted in her chair with the deliberateness of someone who wasn't searching for clarity, but for a strike point. Her fingers tapped the table in rhythm with her breath, slow and tight, like a fuse being measured. She waited until Jasmine had just finished naming a 12-year-old boy, tackled by 3 officers for fitting the description of a car thief, just before she could continue with another child's name. Then Boebert struck, her voice cold and flat, sharpened by contempt, void of hesitation. "Maybe if people like you didn't act like street animals, you wouldn't be treated like one." And then, after a beat that seemed carved out of ice, she leaned closer to the microphone. No smirk, no shift in tone, just something far more chilling: intention. Or maybe, just go back to the zoo. The sentence didn't rise in volume. It didn't need to. It landed with the force of a dropped weapon, precise, public, and unmistakably personal. Time didn't freeze, it recoiled. No one moved, not because they were unsure of what they heard, but because they knew exactly what they heard. The sentence had come from a place too old and too familiar to be misunderstood. Every syllable carried the echoes of centuries, wrapped in modern makeup, broadcast under fluorescent lights in the heart of the so-called free world. The gallery didn't gasp. They stiffened. The collective stillness was louder than any protest. A mother near the back gripped her daughter's wrist so tightly the girl winced. A civil rights attorney sitting by the wall closed his eyes with a slow exhale, like someone watching a wound reopen. Across the room, a security guard's hand flinched near his radio, not because of a threat, but because the air now felt dangerous. One congressional aide, young, white, and visibly shaken, lowered her tablet onto her lap and stared blankly at the floor, unsure whether she was supposed to keep transcribing or start breathing again. In the third row, a retired firefighter who had sat through countless hearings, funerals, and fights for pension reform rose to his feet. With slow, deliberate motion, he took off his navy blue cap, the one with the insignia of his old engine company, and bowed his head. It wasn't an act of protest. It wasn't even a gesture of honor. It was grief. Grief for what had just been said, and for the reality that a statement like that could still be said in the middle of a congressional hearing, on national television, by a sitting member of Congress, and not immediately silenced. Boebert didn't blink. She didn't look around to assess the damage. She didn't need to. She knew what she had done. The words weren't a slip. They were a mirror, held up, thrown down, and ground into the marble under her heel. And Jasmine Crockett, she didn't move. She didn't break eye contact. Her spine remained straight, her hands still locked on the table, as if she were holding on to the very idea of restraint with both fists. Her jaw was set, not in anger, but in the kind of generational endurance passed down from women who have been insulted, belittled, erased, and who never once had the luxury of breaking down when the world broke open in front of them. This wasn't the first time someone had tried to reduce her humanity to metaphor. It wouldn't be the last. But never before had it happened in this room, under oath, under lights, in the heart of the government that claimed to serve all its people. Jasmine's silence in that moment wasn't empty. It was loaded, not with fear, not with pain, but with precision. The kind of silence that comes when your opponent hands you the very blade they intended to cut you with, and you choose not to use it, because you know they've already done more damage to themselves than you ever could. Behind her, one young man in a Howard University sweatshirt slowly stood up. He didn't say a word. He didn't lift a fist. He just stood, like a monument, like a verdict. A few rows over, a woman clutched her purse against her chest, as if trying to hold something sacred inside. The committee chair leaned toward the microphone, unsure whether to intervene, apologize, or run from the moment altogether. No one dared to speak. Not yet. The air was no longer thick. It was unbreathable. Because in a single line, Boebert had made something painfully clear. This wasn't just a disagreement. This wasn't just about politics. This was about who gets to be seen as fully human in America, and who's still being spoken to like they never belonged in the first place. Maybe if people like you didn't act like street animals, you wouldn't be treated like one. Or maybe just go back to the zoo. And there it was. The mask pulled off, the curtain yanked back, the truth no longer whispered in dark corners, but amplified in front of the entire nation. The ballroom was grand in scale, but silent in atmosphere, like a cathedral waiting for its sermon. Polished marble floors reflected the warm glow of chandeliers. Rows of white chairs, accented with gold ribbons, faced a single podium set beneath the seal of the National Institute for Civic Ethics, organizers of the annual Public Integrity Award. The audience was not just powerful, it was generational. Former senators, current judges, constitutional scholars, and student activists sat side by side, bound together by a single shared expectation. They had come to hear her. Jasmine Crockett walked toward the stage in a sleek charcoal suit, her expression composed, shoulders squared, the sound of her heels cutting through the stillness like a metronome. She didn't wave. She didn't pause. She only climbed the stairs and stood behind the microphone, letting the room meet her silence before she gave them her words. For a moment, she looked out across the crowd, not at the dignitaries, but at the younger faces scattered between them. Some were scholarship recipients. Some were just children brought by hopeful parents. Then she began. When they told me I was receiving an award for public integrity, she said, I asked what integrity means when you've spent your life fighting just to be heard as human. The room shifted, not with noise, but with gravity. I learned early that when people don't want to hear you, they try to make you smaller, louder, angrier. And if none of that works, they call you something inhuman and hope it shuts you down. She paused, then added, but what they don't expect is for you to listen, stand taller, and speak anyway. She let the silence stretch again, controlled, waited, and then her voice deepened, steady and deliberate. I didn't respond with rage because I wasn't raised in a cage. I was raised to roar and not apologize for the echo. Gasps rippled in pockets of the room, followed by a slow, thunderous round of applause that started not from the front row, but from the back, from the ones who understood that echo because they'd spent their whole lives being told to silence it. Jasmine didn't blink. She didn't flinch. She stood at that podium like a monument carved from every insult she had ever turned into fuel. People ask me if I was angry, she continued. Of course I was, but anger is not always fire. Sometimes it's steel, quiet, sharp, and waiting. What I said that day wasn't a reaction. It was a reckoning. The applause faded, but the stillness that followed felt louder. Jasmine took a breath, then added, when you've lived long enough in a world that cages your voice, you don't wait for permission to speak. You build a door, you break a wall, and when they tell you you're too loud, you remind them, you weren't raised to whisper your truth just to protect their comfort. She didn't raise her tone. She didn't need to. The words did the lifting. The audience leaned forward, not to hear better, but because they couldn't help it. The weight of her presence was pulling them in like gravity. Near the front, an elderly woman wiped a tear with a satin handkerchief embroidered with the name of her sorority. one founded by black women when the Constitution still ignored their existence. A civil rights lawyer near the aisle closed his notebook, realizing nothing he could write would match what he was hearing. Jasmine looked over them all, not for validation, but with a gaze that said, "You know this. You've lived this." And in the fifth row, a small hand tugged gently on a woman's sleeve. A girl, maybe 8, maybe 9, sat on the edge of her seat, legs swinging above the floor. Her eyes were wide, fixed on the stage. She leaned close to her mother and whispered, just loud enough for the person beside them to hear, "Mom, I want to speak like Miss Jasmine." Or in English, "Mom, I want to speak like her." The mother didn't respond. She just placed her hand on her daughter's knee, nodded once, and turned back to the stage with glassy eyes. She wasn't crying because her daughter had found a hero. She was crying because, for the first time, her daughter had seen possibility spoken in her own skin, her own tone, her own language. In that moment, the echo Jasmine spoke of wasn't just metaphor. It was literal. It had traveled, it had landed, and it had planted itself in a child who might one day take that stage herself. Jasmine, unaware of the whisper, finished her speech with finality, not flourish. "This award is not for how I responded," she said. "It's for every time I didn't flinch. And I didn't flinch because I know who I am. And now so do all of you." Then she stepped back from the mic, not to bask, but to give space for the room to process what it had just witnessed. The applause rose again, but she had already begun to walk off stage. She didn't need to stand an ovation. She had already stood her ground. In the moments that followed, the ballroom buzzed with something deeper than celebration. It vibrated with conviction, with clarity, because Jasmine Crockett hadn't just accepted an award that night. She had closed the chapter on silence and handed the pen to the next generation. And as the echoes of applause faded into the velvet hush of that grand ballroom, the true weight of Jasmine Crockett's journey remained, not in the trophy she held, but in the truth she had lived. What lingered wasn't glory, it was the cost. And it was time to talk about what it taught us. The lesson didn't come wrapped in a ribbon. It came through fire, through restraint in the face of cruelty, through the deep, suffocating injustice of being called subhuman by someone protected by the very system you were sworn to uphold. Jasmine Crockett didn't just endure an insult. She bore witness to a wound still festering in America's bones. And in that moment, when the slur "Go back to the zoo" was hurled across a microphone in the halls of Congress, what was exposed wasn't just one woman's pain, it was an entire nation's unfinished reckoning. But she didn't let that moment devour her. She transformed it. She wielded clarity like a blade, cutting through centuries of coded language and buried hate, not to destroy her opponent, but to hold up a mirror so powerful it couldn't be ignored. The real lesson? That dignity, when chosen over rage, becomes an act of rebellion in itself. But don't mistake her composure for comfort. It cost her something. Every second she held back, every insult she swallowed over the years to arrive at that hearing table, had carved itself into her. And yet when the world watched, she didn't flinch. That restraint wasn't weakness. It was war in slow motion. It was her saying, "You will not define me by your worst assumptions." The real human lesson isn't just that people will try to cage your voice. It's that they'll sometimes do it with applause in the background, with laws, with smiles, with institutional handshakes that still reek of exclusion. And still, Jasmine stood tall, not because she was unshaken, but because she refused to be erased. There is something profoundly unsettling about watching someone be insulted with ancestral cruelty, only to watch them remain calm enough to deliver a lesson back to the very people who harmed them. That is the paradox Jasmine Crockett embodies. The power of not returning violence with violence, but with something sharper: history, context, memory. Her silence in that 7-second pause was louder than any protest chant. It was the sound of generations holding their breath and then exhaling through her voice. The lesson here isn't just about language, it's about legacy. It's about what happens when you survive long enough to speak your truth and finally have a platform to do so. Not every survivor gets that chance. Jasmine did, and she made it count. But this wasn't just Jasmine's moment. It belonged to everyone who had ever been told to sit down when they tried to stand up, To everyone who had ever been called too loud, too angry, too unprofessional, when all they did was tell the truth out loud. Jasmine didn't just speak for herself. She spoke for the girl with her hand raised in a classroom who was never called on, for the boy stopped and searched for fitting a description, for the woman passed over in the boardroom because she didn't fit the culture. She spoke for the lawyer who burned out after fighting one too many losing battles, and for the mother who teaches her child how to survive a traffic stop before they even learn to drive. The lesson here is this: you are not alone, and your voice, your calm, measured, brilliant voice, can be your resistance. The human cost of injustice is not just in the moment of pain, but in the echo, in the way people carry it for years, quietly adjusting how they dress, how they speak, how they breathe in certain rooms. Jasmine's moment was powerful not because she exposed a bigot, but because she exposed a blueprint, a design of exclusion that runs quietly through boardrooms, courtrooms, and even kindergarten classrooms. And she did it without screaming, without name-calling, just truth, delivered like thunder, dressed as a whisper. And the world listened, because it had no choice. What Jasmine Crockett proved, what she etched into the DNA of American discourse, is that justice doesn't always look like a protest. Sometimes it looks like posture, like poise, like a woman refusing to apologize for the space she takes up. The lesson isn't that we should all respond like her. The lesson is that we should all build a world where no one ever has to. Because true integrity isn't how you behave when praised. It's how you respond when dehumanized. Jasmine didn't teach us how to fight back. She taught us how to rise without descending, how to meet cruelty not with submission, but with clarity, how to turn cages into platforms, insults into scholarships, and silence into precedent. So if there is one thing to carry forward, it is this: you do not have to become what the world calls you. You do not have to scream to be heard. You do not have to strike to defend yourself. Your humanity is not up for negotiation, even when others try to auction it off with their microphones. And to the little girl who whispered in that ballroom, "Mom, I want to speak like her," the lesson is already planted. Jasmine didn't just answer her oppressor, she answered you. And she answered with a roar that didn't need volume because it had truth. And when truth is spoken in its most human form, it doesn't just echo, it builds futures. Thank you for watching until this moment and for standing with us on this journey for justice. Your support means everything. Like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss what's next. And we'd love to hear your thoughts. Leave a comment below and let us know what moved you most in this story. Together, our voices make a difference.